Hello and welcome to this episode of Connected Thinking in association with the NLA. I'm joined again by Adam Challis from JLL, who's the Global Director of Strategic Insights. And Adam, you and I met towards the end of last year. We had a session where we spoke about the market then. A lot's happened in the last quarter. And especially with the JLL report coming out for the Q1, I thought it was timely that we sort of sat down again. And so I think what we're going to focus on today really is I suppose, what's happened in the last quarter, where the market dynamics are. Where do you see the real estate sector right now? How's it faring?
Yeah, I guess, first off, thanks very much for having me back. I really enjoyed our conversation last time. And this gives us an opportunity to scorecard to an extent where we were at the end of last year. We saw great momentum finishing up the year. Certainly from the investment side of the house, you saw a real uptick in trades, as is typically the case in Q4, and it came through, and we saw a really strong overall volume of activity through the end of last year. So the headline numbers, 15-16% up on the previous year overall. When you look at the corporate occupier side of the house, the same is also true. Really great momentum carried through into the start of 2026. And of course, that sort of euphemism we've got used to for a while, the cautious optimism, was beginning to needle a little bit more towards optimism. And I think we would have talked about similar tones at the time in December.
Yeah.
That absolutely did carry through into Q1. And so you saw corporate take-up really at best or highest level since 2022. So really, really strong activity. Critically, that activity is also with quite large, or on average larger, occupier requirements. And so you're seeing bigger moves, bigger buildings being underwritten, and that, of course, critical for the square mile with the tall towers that are now in permission and need to get through into construction. So that's all, I think, quite solid positive news. We can talk a little bit more about the detail there, the price points. So your rents are still headlining.
Well, something really interesting that I saw at the end of last year, beginning of this year, was the expectation of rate cuts. Right, there was an optimism around rate cuts coming through, and that actually the yields would tighten, and that would really accelerate money actually getting allocated to specific schemes. That narrative has changed in the last quarter, I would say. There is now a kind of expectation of a couple of rate rises coming this year. The yields have widened. Look at gilts, that market's moved. Where are you seeing the sentiment? Is the sentiment still there to get stuff delivered?
Yeah, and obviously the elephant in the room is the Middle East crisis.
Sure.
And that has significantly changed, I think, at least the narrative. But to be honest, and sort of that story from Q1 has been one of sort of ongoing momentum.
Yeah.
It's been a really, really solid first quarter with now, of course, in March and coming into April, some uncertainty that is really affecting the global economy. So, first and foremost, it's a human tragedy, and we think a lot about the thousands of people that have been killed and the tens of thousands that have been displaced.
Sure.
Before we get on to the economic transmission points, it feels a little bit insincere to be thinking about that in isolation. And there are, of course, colleagues and clients affected right across the region. That said, there has been, I think, in fairness, some hesitancy immediately after the onset of the crisis, but that ceded way pretty quickly, and certainly what we've started to see in the end of the quarter and into April has been real continuity of activity. So again, with respect to take up, as well as with overall investment activity, that stability is there. The big question is to what extent that carries on, and it really hangs off the back of two key factors coming out of the Middle East. The first is the extent to which the Strait of Hormuz remains closed and remains a challenge to global trade and a challenge to global activity, both petrochemical and moving beyond all of the indirect implications for trade, whether that's around fertilizers and food down the road, which is, I think, potentially a looming crisis for next year and the year after. Helium, which is critical for cooling semiconductors and so on. So there are some really important knock-on impacts that are aligned to how quickly we can reopen the strait and get trade flowing again, ungovern the system.
I mean, if you just focus on the commercial sector for a moment, that we spoke last time about sort of flight to quality, and London is a sort of global headquarters magnet. Are you still seeing that sort of flight to quality coming through, and those schemes getting delivered? Are we still seeing that delivery coming through?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been a little uncomfortable with the sort of flight to quality or the safe haven narrative, because I think to a degree, it undermines the fundamentals of what London is. London's got great strengths, which we did talk about last time, around its, its legal integrity, the enshrined property rights, and the inherent characteristics of this regional economy. And so in that respect, yeah, it represents a relatively safer trade. But I would argue that just means in times of uncertainty, investors do move to more stable, more risk-off environments. And this market tends to represent that on average better than many others.
Yeah.
So coming back to the previous question, when you think about rate cuts, clearly that story, that narrative has shifted. I wouldn't put too much stock into the rate hike narrative that seems to be out there. I think markets are really struggling to at least price where we are at the moment, and certainly you wouldn't expect central banks to be thinking about a relatively uncontrollable shock being worth being appropriate to sort of manage through rate hikes. And so this inflation should be transitory, and we should be seeing, all things being equal, a return to relative normality. And that, of course, goes back to the point around whether the Strait of Hormuz is reopened. And additionally, the extent to which the critical infrastructure in the region can be repaired in a timely manner.
Yeah, and we've got the fundamentals, I suppose, for London, that actually there is a bottleneck in terms of the amount of space being delivered compared to the demand that's out there. And we've seen this with a whole bunch of financial services firms, needing to take up extra space, needing to have adjunct offices, needing to go for bigger floor plates, and we're seeing that demand there. Yeah. And I suppose that bottleneck will have to sort of widen at some point. Hopefully not just propped up by high rents, but actually the fundamental market demand coming through as well on capital increases.
You're right, and of course, supply has continued to tighten. If there's been any constraint in real estate activity, it's been around a lack of supply, not on the demand side. And again, both in the corporate space, where that take-up has been really, really solid, we see the requirement need actually continuing to ratchet up further, so that the proportion of space that is unmet, that is out in the market seeking new space, that continues to ratchet up against that real weakness of supply. Now, the corporation of the City of London has been, I think, pretty successful and progressive in getting schemes through the planning process and successfully permitted. Clearly, that upward pressure on rents is making more and more properties viable, but we will see a continued tightness of supply. And it's worth noting, this is part of my job, is that that's not even just a London story. We're seeing that pretty consistently around major markets in the planet, in New York, and Tokyo, and Paris. Yeah. You have real challenges of particularly new supply, high quality space, which is the bit that corporates are really seeking out. There's just nowhere near enough high quality space, and that upward pressure on rents will remain a feature.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I was at the CPA AGM just this week, and the sort of message being delivered by the corporation was, this is the year of delivery. We really need to see spades in the ground and those schemes coming through that have been consented. There's a lot of towers consented, and it's about making sure that delivery pipeline is met, right? So I think that's very much in tune with the way policymakers are thinking about this as well. We've got, I think now, a good platform of legislation NPPF hopefully coming through over the summer. We've got the Planning Act through. There's some really good nuggets of legislation in there that hopefully give more transparency on the planning process to the market. And then, of course, the London Plan eventually making its way through as well. These things hopefully will give the market a bit more confidence, do you think?
I mean, without question, that policy backdrop provides stability, provides relative certainty. And it's important, I think, to broaden this conversation out to think about the real specific challenges in the residential space and getting more viable schemes consented and through the machinations of regs to be able to be deliverable, to be under construction and contributing to supply right across the 10-year spectrum. And that, I think, is one of the real kind of specific challenge areas for London. We've seen a weakness in overall delivery there. The range of challenges as well cited in both the popular press and in the trade press on why that is. But ungumming the planning system, particularly for housing across London, across that range of tenures, I think is critical to support what London can be about and is already about as we look forward into hopefully a cycle and a phase of economic growth.
And it's interesting, I was looking at the GLA economics numbers that came through recently, showing to 2050, huge growth in population in the working community in London. One of the risks I see in that, well, I think it's a great story for London. I think one of the risks we have is infrastructure. Infrastructure has to keep up with that demand. I mean, are we seeing infrastructure being an attractive segment of the built environment?
Such a good call out. The first point that I'd make is maybe a really obvious one, but one that is almost easily overlooked already, and that is the Elizabeth line.
Sure.
When was the last time you had a conversation with anyone that talked about the cost escalations and the delays?
Yeah.
That conversation's moved on. I believe we're now through 800 million riders on that critical piece of infrastructure, what had been the largest construction project in Europe, and what a success story that is. And the way it's almost rewritten the script on local markets and geographies in terms of accessibility, in terms of underwriting real estate value and creating opportunity for new places, new supply to come forward. It's such a good example, but unfortunately too rare an example. We need so many more, not just critical transport infrastructure, but energy. The next big challenge for this city and many other cities is to be able to meet our energy requirements as we electrify everything, our cars, our data centers, and the needs there, buildings themselves. From a decarbonization standpoint, there's an energy requirement that, of course, flows through, and these conversations are almost never disconnected. Of course, that's directly related to what's happening in the Middle East and being much more conscious of our energy sovereignty as well.
Okay, so you've led me into my next piece here, because obviously energy and data centers leads onto the question of AI, right? And we've seen certain sectors of the market absolutely embracing and adopting AI and developing their sort of future pipeline of skills for what role AI will play in those industries. Where do you think the built environment is in that? And do you think we're doing the right things to encourage the use of AI? Are we dissuaded from it? Where do you think the market sentiment is on AI?
Again, another really, really good question. The built environment, I think it's fair to say, is typically seen as a bit of a laggard when it comes to technology adoption. I think you could have put AI into that same bucket, and I'm not sure I would entirely. And the reason why is actually a pretty straightforward one. The potential to undermine one of those big challenges that real estate and the built environment broadly has around heterogeneous data sets, a real lack of true transparency around the built form. AI has a really, particularly now with agentic solutions, has a really important role in undermining, or relatively speaking, improving the transparency of the data that underpins the built environment. So what do I mean by that, rather than talking in the abstract. The ability to better manage the energy systems, the lighting in the room, the air quality through sensors, and then to be able to adjust relatively automatic with that big data flow into a combination with property technology solutions. There's a really nice symmetry there that I think has an overweight value and benefit in the built environment.
So do you think we're at that point where we're going from horse-drawn carriage to combustion engine and the market's going, that'll never work? Are we at that point?
it's a metaphor that I've heard before, and it's not wrong. We are transitioning significantly. That leads me into maybe a different point that I often make when we talk about artificial intelligence, and that's one around the sort of the behavior change. It's natural to think about loss aversion. I think about the impact on roles and jobs and tasks, and what we tend to overlook, and the combustion engine is such a good example in this respect, is what the opportunity set looks like. As we begin to better understand this tool that is available ubiquitously, we've all got access to it. Adoption rates in our survey from the end of last year showed somewhere around 90-odd%, a little bit higher for occupiers, a little bit lower for investors. But I suspect 4 or 5 months on from that survey, that's looking at more or less 100% or pretty darn close to it. It's table stakes. We're all beginning to use artificial intelligence in some way to enable our day-to-day roles. Where it then begins to be a workflow improvement, where we're beginning to think about how we do things differently and explore opportunity sets, which might be for new service lines in a business like ours. It might be for new markets that you can go after that you previously found too high a hurdle rate or not worth exploring. The opportunity set becomes really exciting.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting feature. What I think we're sort of under-indexing on in this conversation is the extent to which that opportunity set will be explored and its relationship to the underlying economic story. Where you've got a weak economy, you've got a risk-off environment. You tend to think a little bit more cautiously. Yeah. Where you've got growth, and all things being equal, we should be looking into a cycle of growth and improvement. There's a really great story there, a narrative around what the opportunity set will bring to us, or what we will create through that environment. And that's unknowable, but I tend to look at that through the lens of optimism.
Yeah, and actually, one of the things I've seen over the years is we have a resource issue in this sector. We cannot get the right skilled people into the sector, to be attracted to the sector, to then build their careers in the sector. And actually, if we flipped that and used the involvement of AI into the sector as a positive and said, actually, the skills we now need to help with that under-resourcing need to be skills that understand and adopt and embrace AI. Actually, the sector could be on the verge of a revolution or a renaissance.
Yeah, absolutely. I hark back to Mark Farmer's report, Modernize or Die, which must be getting close to 14, 15 years old now. And at that point, it felt like it was mission critical to solve for the human workforce, the talent challenge. We were retiring much more quickly than we were bringing apprentices in through the construction space, which that report sets out with absolute clarity. But I think the point applies more broadly to professional services right the way through the built environment. So where technology can be an enabler to support activity, getting jobs done when we don't have folk coming through, where it can be an attractive inducement for talent to say, hey, the built environment, that's a really interesting space.
It's forward thinking,
Yeah, absolutely. Where it creates a range of new opportunities and new possibilities. That's got to be a great thing for the built environment overall. And I'd link that to a related but separate point, which is also how AI and agentic solutions can help us tackle some of the bigger challenges we have in buildings. So decarbonizing our built environment, where agentic solutions can be a part of enabling the circular economy, the reuse of building materials. there's so many different use cases that at the moment maybe have a high hurdle rate in ROI terms, but actually agentic solutions may well bring us different solutions, and of course that's a benefit to the built environment, but it's a benefit to society.
Yeah. Lastly, I think I want to sort of touch on, I want to go back to the macro picture a little bit. London as a city faces macroeconomic pressures like everywhere else. What do you think are the critical bits that we ought to be focusing on? And a lot of the risks are perceived, and then there's the real risks. And actually, from your perspective, with the insights you have in your role, where do you see that perception versus reality piece, and what are the bits we should be focusing our attention on, and what are the bits we could ignore?
Yeah, okay. I'll focus on three areas, and actually we picked up two of them already to a degree. The first, one of your earlier questions was around the infrastructure, whether that's energy, transport, making sure that the city works. The city's got to function. The quality of life has to inherently be there as a backdrop to working conditions, living conditions, and our enjoyment of space. And I think we're reappraising and reappreciating what it means to be urban dwellers and to have a high quality of life in a post-pandemic world where we're much more as individuals in control of how we spend our time, where we spend our time. So the critical infrastructure that makes the city function, that for me is a really important story. The second one around affordable housing, small case and uppercase A, affordable housing. Housing has to be accessible to all, and the UN would say it's a human right. I ascribe to that view. We've got to have housing across the tenure spectrum, across the price points, leveraging that transport accessibility so that folk can move around the city with ease to access jobs and access their places that they desire to be. Where you see that those two pieces not working symbiotically, cities around the world, is where you see economies that aren't functioning as well as they could, where the cost of living, and of course we're in an environment where that accelerated cost of living over the last several years is still bearing down on far too many households. There's a whole rabbit hole we can go on there, but I'll just make that point. Where that instead is enabling a quality of life and access to great and exciting jobs, then you start to get into the right sort of rhythm. And that brings me to my third and final sort of critical London opportunity, and that is around the skills and talent itself. Yep. So where you can enable innovations, we've just released a piece of work which you do every couple of years called Innovation Geographies, and it's unlocking or trying to understand how you unlock the locations that are most fertile ground for innovation. So what are the characteristics that make those places work? Of course, it relies on talent and skills, and there are many places around the world that are hotbeds of brilliant thinkers, brilliant minds, and brilliant capability. But they've got to have access to capital to be able to do something with that innovation, to be able to scale up and to be able to participate economically with those ideas. So the skills and the talent piece. But this, it comes right back to those first 2 points, so that they all work together. You've got to have a city that delivers quality of life, delivers a relatively sensible cost of living, so that talent is attracted, is retained, is sticky, and you can, as a result, with that fertile ground, drive real innovation. London does that really well and has done historically for a very long time. But as ever, the cities can't rest on their laurels. Yeah. And so you think about this bit of the geography, the sort of city fringe and moving up towards King's Cross. There's some really fantastic, next generation economy type activities taking place. Yeah. AI underpinned notably, prop tech more generally, a range of sectors that will benefit from that fertile ground. But it's a constant race, it's a constant battle to stay on top, to stay competitive in a global environment.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on something there that I think is really it's worth saying is we've done this organically, and actually what we're doing now is we're starting to articulate these things, because what you've done there, the three areas you've identified are areas that historically have evolved over time and adapted to the market and the circumstances. Actually, there is a value in articulating these things to actually get people focusing on the right bits of reality that need to be changed. And I think that's something that policymakers and the industry have to kind of zone in on, don't they?
Entirely agree. I think, unfortunately, far too often Londoners have a tendency to have a downer on this great city.
I think that's just a sort of British culture thing.
And maybe it is. Maybe it is. Of course, somebody who grew up in Canada, I see things a little bit differently. And at times it's frustrating because I think it undermines the extraordinary potential of the city, the extraordinary reality that I like to think most of us experience day in, day out. And not to say that London doesn't have its challenges and problems, but we tend to be pretty good at facing up to them and trying to tackle them. That isn't true everywhere around the world. And that, of course, is a characteristic that we should, I think, take a little bit more pride and, dare I say it, a little bit more confidence from. This city is incredibly good at tackling difficult issues, but being very progressive and forward-looking. Where we can organize our thoughts and be collective in our mindset, looking out to the world, is where I think we'll see greater chances of success in attracting capital and attracting talent. All of that ends up being to the good for the built environment.
Brilliant. Well, look, Adam, thank you so much for your time today. I think everyone appreciates your insights, and we'll come back next quarter and revisit this episode and say, right, what happened, what didn't happen.
We should do that. Maybe don't hold me to account on too many. Try not to be too much into the prognostication, but inevitably, things will continue to evolve. We're in a poly-crisis environment, at least in macro terms, but the city continues to do a great job of reinventing itself, and that's something we should take heart in.
Great. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Shane.